Alright, let's go into the other two new releases from this past weekend. And I think we're going to start with The Green Knight, just because I'm kind of excited to talk about it. so, um, I didn't really have. I knew a lot of people that were like really hyped for this, but I honestly really had no idea what it was. Apart from it being David Lowery's new movie, who had done like Ain't Them Body Saints and A Ghost Story and the Pete's Dragon remake. Um, which is, for the most part, I didn't. I was half and half on A Ghost Story. It was kind of in that middle section. It kind of started to lose me when it started to spell itself out a little too much. But as far as his storytelling, but especially his visuals, he's been showing for quite some time now how extremely, just kind of strong of a filmmaker he is overall. Um, and and unlike many like him, he often can have writing to back it up, which is really refreshing. And that really shows here also with him adapting this. This is another reason that I didn't have many expectations going in. Is I'm not really necessarily that drawn to the whole Arthurian legend kind of stuff. Like I don't really, I don't dislike it, but I don't really, I just kind of go in with no expectations. Like I could take or leave them. But it seemed just when you hear Lyra's name alone, and you saw you saw this even with stuff like Pete's Dragon, where it's like, even if just from the sounds of it, you're like, oh yeah, I know that thing. Um, Larry will show it to you in a way to where you may know that thing, but you have not seen it through his eyes just yet. And that's something that we kind of used to make fun of a lot, where it was like they'd always tell these retellings and say like, oh, it's not the story you think you know and stuff like that, and they'd beat you over the head with that and end up trying too hard. You can really tell that Lowry just kind of tells the story the way he sees things, and after you see a handful of his movies, you get a craving to see things through his. You basically want to see any story through his vision, especially now that this is here, and does it in a way that it's on such a grand scale we've never seen from him before. And the fact that he can be, because sometimes there's a bit of trouble when directors like him kind of do these small movies and then transition to movies that are like really big and kind of have an epic scale, and something kind of gets lost along the way. Yeah, that didn't happen to him. If anything, he's even stronger now that he seems to have more to work with and a bigger scale to work with. And I really hope this opens a lot of doors for him and people just giving him whatever money he needs to make whatever vision he wants to make, because I feel like we need more movies like this one where, even though it comes from legend and from characters we know and loosely stories we know in a sense, there's something that just feels so original about it, that's kind of insane. Like, this is one of those cases where there's a lot of movies that are built up where you could have people like come out of them and say like, oh man, that was insane. Like you would not believe how insane that was. Um, and usually it doesn't really live up that much, if you say something like that. But this is a case where you could come right out of the theater and say, "Holy shit, this was insane! You have no idea what I just saw. Oh my god, this is insane." I could say that all day, and I don't know that it would prepare for, because I had heard, as it was kind of rolling out and getting seen, there were a few voices I heard saying that it had trouble living up to the hype because the hype was so big, after it had been seen. But since I went in with practically no expectations, like I'd maybe seen a couple of stills, and of course I avoid trailers when I can, so I didn't really see much of anything for this visually going in. This was all basically new to me. I think the only image I had seen was what's basically the poster where he's raising the axe in the air, which is the giant scene in the movie. And yeah, it's one of those cases where pretty much from the opening shot, you just know, like you're gonna know right away if you're in it, just from the first shot alone. Because there's that feeling that's not very common, where there's that feeling that will come over you when a movie starts sometimes, where you just know that you're in this. And there are some times where a lot of movies like that, when they get you really early, might run out of gas quickly, or at least at the halfway mark. And this one didn't really. It was, if I had sat down in front of the camera just now, having just come out of it, I probably would have told you that around the time Joel Edgerton's character comes into it, and we spend some time in that area, is where it kind of started to wind down for me, and I was kind of starting to fade in and out of it. Um, but I saw this and Stillwater back to back, and I saw this first. So there were times where I was spacing out during Stillwater, where I was thinking about this. And now that it's had this time to settle in a little bit, even though I was watching another movie at the time, it's I feel much better about the whole thing. Where like it's one of those things where it's just gonna kind of keep creeping in there. Like there was the whole portion of Stillwater where I was thinking about this, but even in the next few days at least, I'm sure it's still gonna be creeping in there and finding other things to just really like dwell on and realize just in retrospect how amazing they really were, even though the whole experience of the movie is already kind of there anyway. Um, I mean, there are moments that might feel a bit too dragged out. Like I think it's about 2 hours and 10 minutes. Just a solid 2 hours probably could have done it. Um, but that's I don't want to take away from just what the whole experience of this movie is. Um, and because I had also kind of heard like a long ass time ago, like maybe going on a year and a half ago, I had heard about how people were gonna get like horror vibes from this or something, and I feel like you hear that about a lot of movies that just don't have. I don't know why that's a popular thing to do. To say like something that's totally not horror related has horror elements or a horror feel, and they typically just don't. I don't know where that comes from, but yeah, weirdly enough, and I don't know if I would have believed it going into this, or I don't know if I did believe it going into this. But yeah, there's just a whole tone in this movie. I mean, I'm sure the story itself probably has a lot to do with that, because the story itself, it sort of lends itself to this feeling of like a really particular dread. Like you could just throw the word dread around, but I mean really sort of specific kind of existential dread that this movie brings out, and it's this feeling. And I'm sure this obviously the score is helping this a lot. Also, the score at times is like kind of deeply unsettling, especially in context. But it's this whole feeling where yeah, it is almost like the kind of dread you would get from like a really well made horror movie is what you feel a lot during this. Um, and what's interesting about that and the way they balance that tone is that Dev Patel's character is coming from a pretty relatable place at first. When, he's just around doing his thing, and then he is called forward by King Arthur and asked basically for his story. Because Arthur says, like, I want to know you, if you're going to be in this whole thing. So just, give me your story, or give me a story that just lets me know you. And he's got nothing. And he's assured it's just because it hasn't happened yet, but you just get that sense in Patel's performance here. That's just all like there's no words. There's just all expression, and it's all in the eyes. Just like I don't know if shame is the right word, but this sort of just feeling like there's been nothing worthy of greatness in your life. Like there's nothing significant that you have ever done or that has ever happened to you or anything. Just no story to tell whatsoever. Which is a thought that's as sad as it is terrifying, and the other way around. And the way this movie captures that feeling is basically what its whole kind of foundation is. Because it does seem to have this whole thing going on where it's like how much of a pedestal just greatness, just that word or that whatever, or that thought gets put on. Because it's like when you think of, because like you would think that about Arthur, obviously, especially at this particular point in Arthur's story. But it's like when we see him And the way Sean Harris plays him is it's like he's really like worn down and his voice is like really weak and he has like toothaches. And it's like you just get this sense that even if a greatness even does happen, eventually it wears down and just becomes almost like you come back to square one by the end. And that's where a lot of it feels like just like this really existential story, and it's like the way it sort of kind of the movie kind of works to defy that whole setup of the main character must do something to reach greatness, and how it's almost kind of in the reverse, in how he inadvertently fucks himself over and gets himself into the situation that he's in throughout the movie when he meets the Green Knight, who's here for the Christmas game, as they call it, which sounds so jovial and happy. But when the Green Knight appears, I was immediately so happy I saw this in a theater when the Green Knight first appeared. Because it's one thing of the visuals and the way he kind of comes and creeps out of the darkness, but the sound that accompanies him. Obviously, like, whenever, because he's like half tree, or really mostly tree, just the way he moves and the sound effects that come with it are so like precise, and it's almost jarring how you can just hear his every creak and every move. But it's especially when he rides in on his horse, where the sounds of his horse's hooves are so heavy in the theater. Like you can feel them as they happen, and there's just this immediate. That's when you can tell that kind of the kind of path this story's going down. Where it's like you can see it as like, oh, it's a story, and I can relate to this guy because he doesn't really have a story to tell, and he needs to do his thing in order to reach that greatness that everybody hopes to meet at some point before they die. And then it's just almost like hope itself just comes crashing down at the sound of these hoofbeats and then ultimately the appearance of the Green Knight himself. Who's played by Ralph Ineson, who I like to call the man of the godlike voice, and which is obviously perfect casting. And yeah, just pretty much immediately from that point on, there's just this constant sort of sense of fear, even though it has like, because another thing it kind of seems to set up and then defy is the idea of like, kind of like the adventure movie or the journey movie, where every time, like a lot of movies like that almost kind of have this episodic feel where you just kind of go from one thing to the next. Like you'll have one sort of set piece and then the character will move on and then there's another and so on. But it's like the farther he goes down, like the darker the path gets. It's like he's going into a forest that there's like no end to, and it just gets darker and scarier as it goes. And there's a lot of stuff that kind of mirrors what's going on and how he got here to begin with. Like the whole setup being that he has to the Christmas game being that if he strikes the Green Knight, he'll get his axe, but in return he has to go to the Green Chapel where the Green Knight resides, and the Green Knight gets to do the exact same strike to him, whatever that may be, whether small or big or whatever. And of course, I guess I don't know. I guess not realizing he's practically immortal, decides to cut his head off, and so that's what Dev Patel's character has to look forward to in the next year at the end of this journey. And just that in itself obviously really sets up this thing that I've talked about so many times, because it's an unwanted obsession that I have. Like, it's not something that I choose to obsess over, it's just there in my head constantly. The idea of accepting the inevitability of death. It kind of basically feels like what the movie ultimately is as well. And there's a lot of symbolism behind that, especially the fact that I've come to realize while watching his movies that David Lowery really has a thing for skeletons and bones. That's really chilling in an unpleasant way. Like there's I think it was his first movie or one of his first movies, Saint Nick, which is a special feature on the Anthem Body Saints DVD. There's a little girl in that movie whose thing is she likes to carry around a box that has a dog's skeleton in it, and it's really fucked up. And then I remember a pretty disturbing use and reveal of a skeleton in a ghost story during like a flash forward kind of thing. Um, and there's a lot of it here. Like I said, this story basically being about the inevitability of death and accepting death and all that stuff. I guess it makes sense to like really have that as a heavy focus. But like I was talking about with how there's events that sort of mirror his journey, where we have he has a run in with a spirit that ends up being kind of ironic in an interesting way and kind of a fascinating way. And there's the whole thing where after he meets Joel Edgerton, and Edgerton kind of gives this whole thing about them exchanging. Like he's talking about how Edgerton basically took him in, and he's showing him all these acts of kindness, and Edgerton talks about, eventually we can, exchange one act to another. And it kind of gives back the vibe of the exchanging blows with the Green Knight in a sort of way. Kind of. Maybe I'm reaching, I don't know. But that's the vibe I was taking away from this. And I think this is one of those things that's just kind of made to be interpreted in whatever way you do. Movies like this, I don't really... Like, obviously, Larry Shirley has, things in mind. But these are also kind of movies that are made to be kind of just, out there, and to whoever picks it up and what they take from it is what it will be to them, and that's the end of it. And also, there's, when I was talking about, like, the scale of it, and the fact how there's a lot of, like, long shots, which obviously typically have been becoming a gimmick lately, especially when it's like fit as much action into the shot as you can is what it usually is. But I really love these long shots because they're definitely more served to just kind of show the size in general of not just the sets and the journey itself and everything, where it's like he meets Barry Keoghan at one point, and they're on this battlefield, and it's just this shot that goes on for a long time of just him walking alongside him while he's on his horse, and they have this kind of exchange. And the shot just keeps going, and it's like you can just see how massive this battlefield is, just the longer this conversation goes on and the camera doesn't cut around, it just kind of stays on them, but you can see in the background just how massive and endless everything looks. And I love when they're used to that, because it's almost kind of done in like kind of a subtle way to show, to where it just kind of dawns on you after a while just how massive everything feels, just in this shot alone. And that's there's a few shots like that. Like the shot of Patel first leaving is a really big one as well. Like I said, just the longer it goes, the bigger and bigger the whole scale of it feels, which is great. Like I said, that whole thing of him just kind of going from one event to the next, or one run into the next, or whatever, and it's sort of like just how the whole thing kind of has this surreal quality to it. So it's like the way, like usually you would think just kind of an episodic feel of this happened and then this happened and this happened, but the way with the overall feel that it has, it almost feels more like when you're dreaming, and the way one dream kind of bleeds into the next one, and you're just kind of in the next dream before you even are, like you don't even register that you've changed dreams. And that's what it kind of feels when he goes from one situation to the next, how they just kind of bleed into the other, and it all feels like this sort of stream of, I don't know if stream of consciousness is what I'm looking for, but it's that kind of vibe, basically. And it just sort of carries you along, which obviously is going to help with the pacing quite a bit. Like I said, we may reach a bit of a, I was going to say dry spot when we reach this Edgerton and Alyssa Vikander scenes, but for more reasons than one, that's probably not the the word I want to use. But yeah, there's even crazy fucked up shit happening in this sequence, and this was the sequence where I was like, it's slowed down a little bit. which is crazy. So that's a compliment in itself. Until we get on our climax, which the less said about it, the better. So that's I think that's basically all I can really say without saying too much about the events I would have really. I gotta say, and I could explain and go on and on about how oh, it's amazing, and oh, this looks really great, or oh, just the feel of it, or just the general craziness of it. But you really just kind of have to see it. Like, it's not really the kind of thing that can be described to you, and you'll get like the full vision or the full experience. You definitely have to, especially like I said, especially with like theater sound, is really really beneficial. So I was really, because that was the thing too where I didn't really think, because our theater doesn't really get much outside of like the super mainstream. So that we got this and a Tom McCarthy movie. We've never had, even Spotlight, we've never had a Tom McCarthy movie here until Stillwater. I had to go out of town to see Spotlight. And the fact that we got these like on the same weekend was like crazy. Like I didn't honestly wasn't sure we'd get either of them. I really wasn't expecting to see The Green Knight at this particular theater at all. So that kind of blew my mind, and I'm so incredibly happy because I don't know that I would have the same passion for it that I do now if the first viewing was like a home viewing, because it's just so. So the benefit of the sound and just it being so big and massive is really it's if you can see it as big as possible. I know we're getting back into kind of questionable times for this, um, but it's yeah, yeah, it's one of those. So, um, so I guess I'll leave that at that, and we'll go into Stillwater. Um, and obviously, this had a lot of build up because it was a Tom McCarthy movie starring Matt Damon, which in any other case would sound like it has awards all over it. And the story kind of gives that vibe also. Though it did kind of feel funny watching this a few days after it came out because it's like I was just in time to see it for all the controversies that are coming out now. With Amanda Knox feeling exploited, which I can get, and Damon saying shit that he shouldn't be again. But I do try to just kind of focus on the movie because so many movies kind of get controversies like this kind of at the last minute as they come out. So yeah. So as far as Damon playing this kind of character, I do think Damon can be. I know this is really weird to say because it's like he's been the face of so many great movies, especially recently. And he seems to be a draw for the most part. I know this isn't doing as well, but that could be a number of things. But for the most part, people tend to love Matt Damon, especially he's got Bourne in the mix. But I still kind of feel like Matt Damon almost might be just a tad underrated as far as the different things that he can do. Because I know like some people were upset about his casting in True Grit. Mostly older people, they're John Wayne fans. Thought he was weird casting in True Grit, and that's him in True Grit might be one of my favorite performances of his because it's just so kind of off the path of him. And you can definitely say that about this as well, where you could like you see the poster and you're like, oh, Matt Damon slapped on a goatee. Now he's apparently this all American dude or whatever. But no, it's really early when Matt Damon kind of disappears and this character Bill kind of takes the forefront. I know that's kind of a cliche way to put it, but it's true. This dude feels so incredibly real and so incredibly un-Matt Damon that it is kind of amazing. And the whole thing about how the way he and McCarthy approached this character to where it's like I guess like there's two different extreme ways this character could have been played. He could have been like an extreme, caricature and almost like the portrayal's kind of making fun of him, despite playing him as the stoic hero. But then there's the other side that could have maybe made him a bit too saintly for the kind of character that he's supposed to be. Like this is the kind of guy where it's like he prays like 3 different times in like the first 5 or 10 minutes. And so it could have been one of those cases where it's almost like the movie's trying to beat you over the head with, oh, look how good of a person this guy is, and now he's, all the all American dude and all that. But he's definitely flawed for sure, and the movie has no qualms about telling you how flawed he is, and at times, especially in the later third, showing you how imperfect he is, to put it mildly. And you can especially see that in the way he interacts with Abigail Breslin and how she feels about him. And how in like their first scene they seem like they're a really loving father and daughter, and they have this really great relationship. And he's here in France to visit her after she's been put in prison for this murder that she didn't commit. But as it rolls on, it is quickly revealed how like she does. There's no doubt that she does love him, but she's also got so much resentment and sees him as such like an emotional obstacle in her life repeatedly. And there's a lot of tragedy in her life that she feels ultimately comes back to him. And you can really see the complexity of the situation, which ultimately brings out the complexity of the individual characters themselves, which is really well done, especially with Breslin's performance and the way her and Damon play off each other. And there's even times where she gets kind of her individual moments as well, where she's talking to this potential love interest for Damon while she's out on like a parole day before she has to go back in. And she talks about how, and it's been built up at this point that, you know, this Damon's character's like really sort of turning a corner, and he's really starting to start this new great life in France, and he's becoming a different person and all that, and for the better. And then we just get this kind of hope crushing moment where Breslin's talking about him and how she truly feels about him, and she says how like, you know, this may seem all well and good, but at the end of the day, it never fails. He will fuck up because he's a fuck up. He just always fucks up. That is the end of the road for every single. That's the end for every single road he goes down. And then she gets into this really sort of deep space where she talks about how, basically looking at herself, and it's like how the fact that she sees him being a fuck up is basically hereditary to her. Like she's inherited how much of a fuck up he is, and that's why she's in this situation. Further adding, putting blame on herself, but also, at the end of the day, so much of her pain comes back to him. And to have this be such a prominent thing for a character that's built up this much to be as likable as possible was such a really interesting sort of back and forth. And it's like, and it might sound inconsistent the way I describe it, but that's not the way it is. Like this all gradually kind of comes out. And the way Damon has so many subtleties in this performance, you can really get the hint of like, when we see him when he's like with these new people, we can see that, you know, this is a guy that's trying to make a new life, and we're kind of rooting for him. But then there's enough subtleties in there that are kind of put in before we really see Breslin's perspective, and then also after, as it's kind of, we've seen another side of him or heard another side of him, that we can kind of see where Breslin's going. Like when Breslin says that, it's not necessarily some big shocking reveal. Like it's kind of like they've progressed enough with how they build up his character that as these things, it can be surprising to the extent that she resents him. But for the most part, it's well laid out enough that we get the sense of we're getting a full, like, well-rounded look at exactly what this guy is, both his good and his bad qualities. And I could see it being a popular criticism that a lot of that may be thrown out the window when we kind of reach the last third, where it goes in a different direction. I actually think there's one particular scene that kind of, well, maybe a couple of particular scenes close together that I feel like propel us towards this enough. Like it still feels like a major curveball, but I don't think it's completely out of the blue either. With the kind of the lead in we get, it's a last minute lead in, but there is a lead in nonetheless. So there is that. So when I was talking about the Green Knight, I was talking about how while I was watching, still like a lot of this is very complimentary, I would think. But when I was talking about the Green Knight, I was saying that I found myself just thinking about the Green Knight while I was watching Stillwater. Like, I was spacing out a lot. And that's kind of, like, even if I hadn't just seen the Green Knight, like 20 minutes prior, there are still a lot of portions in Stillwater where I think I would have been kind of zoning out and like struggling to keep my mind focused on the movie itself, because the movie has a lot of different things it's trying to, like, it has a lot of different stories it's trying to tell and a lot of different focuses it wants to have, whether it be the father-daughter relationship or Damon kind of trying to start this new life, and this whole investigation into who actually killed this girl that his daughter is accused of. Um, and it's and I think all three of these aspects are strong enough individually that they would have worked as their own movies. Like, I would have probably liked a movie that was all about Damon starting a life with these new people, and his whole relationship with Breslin, and how, because of things that have happened in the way his character is or has been in the past, has really pushed them apart. But you can tell they're both kind of hanging on to this as much as they can. Him more so, but she's, putting as much effort as she can, given how she feels into it, which is a really interesting relationship to watch. And then there's just the whole investigating aspect, which does kind of bring back memories of Spotlight and Spotlight's style and how the story was told. How McCarthy told it, to where it was like, it was there's a lot unraveling, and there's a whole investigation angle going from like person to person and getting more and more information and going in different directions, and different suspects or whatever. But it's not like over dramatized. That kind of threw me off the first time I saw Spotlight, was how not over dramatized it was. How like really really low key it felt, despite the fact that it was having these big reveals going on. And it took a couple of viewings of Spotlight for me to really appreciate that. And you get the same kind of sense here, but I do think just in general this isn't near as. And I don't know if it's the way the story's told or the way it's executed or what, but it just felt like there were long stretches here, where it felt very hard to maintain interest, and maybe that was the bouncing around also. It made it hard to really invest in like one particular of the storylines that were going on here. So if the investigation thing was maybe its own story and like its own movie, I would have been much more drawn to it. But you got all this other stuff going on, and you may think like, it raises the stakes a little more, to get all these different perspectives and see them as like humans and how they interact and their relationships with each other. When we get to the more dramatic things towards the end, but I said, really, it just kind of feels the whole time like we're just kind of jumping around from three different things, and they never quite reach like an emotional point where they all collide. So that kind of felt like it was missing. And there are cases where it's long. It's 2 hours and 20 minutes, which I kind of like. Something kind of sank inside me when I saw that. That's pretty fucking long for a movie like this, but. Maybe McCarthy's got something here, but it's mainly just this whole. It's got a little too much going on at once, and it's trying to get us to invest in a lot of different things that can only maintain our interest so much when they're all trying to happen at the same time. And you feel that. You really feel that length. And there are some cases where feeling the length might be okay if it's like an epic story and you're getting to a certain point and you feel like The Revenant comes to mind, where The Revenant does feel like 2 hours and 45 minutes, but to kind of feel that exhaustion that DiCaprio does by the end of it, when you reach that point, makes the movie all the more satisfying. And here, it's. Because a lot of the time is spent on Damon kind of creating this new life. Like, there's a 4-month jump, like, in the middle of it. But even with that in there, enough is established here. Like, it really takes its time for this whole Damon kind of starting this new life with these people, and his relationship with the little girl especially is really nice. But when it finally does reach the point that it's reaching, and it's like like if there was less to focus on, that might have been more of a oh, now these things are going to collide. This is a really big deal. But it's almost like just when you kind of get used to one thing and you kind of get wrapped up in it, then it when it goes into the other thing, it just sort of takes you kind of out of it again, and you kind of have to find your interest again. And that's the thing is you kind of have to keep looking for your own interest as you keep losing it as the movie goes on and goes from one thing to the next and then back again and then on to another thing and all that, and just it's a lot. The whole movie's just a lot. And not really giving you that draining feel in the way that it probably was meant to, like in the way that it should. It just feels like you're watching a really long ass movie, which is what it is. So yeah, but like I said, the individual performances, like the like the little girl Maya, is really good. Usually characters like that might tend to be annoying or too precocious or something, but she plays it pretty perfectly, and then her back and forth with Damon are great. And Breslin has some really great moments here also, like the one I mentioned before, but there's also some earlier moments when we see her when he's there visiting her, and when she comes out, either it's like, hey, she's so happy to see her dad, but then other cases it's like you can kind of see the you kind of get a sense of what it must be like on the inside just by looking at her face, and like how the way her like mental well being in general is taking such a dive, and how there's like this just that constant uncertainty of if they're gonna be able to get her out of here or not, or prove her innocence or not. And there's a lot of desperation and a lot of heartache, that she's able to play out really well. A lot of different emotions she has to have. Like I said, and especially since a lot of those are dependent on how we see Damon's character, who's the main focus, makes her such an important piece of this whole puzzle. This puzzle that's not quite fitting together, but there's something in its individual pieces, like I was saying. So there is that, but like I said, as far as a whole, it's just a lot, and because there's so much, they're just really taking stuff away from each other, as far as our investment and emotion and all that. So that's kind of unfortunate. So I think that's basically what the mess of Stillwater is, for the most part. There's like, especially when it gets towards the end, there's a lot of like convoluted stuff too and stuff like that. Stuff that you kind of tend to expect from movies that kind of almost betray themselves once they reach their last third. But yeah, which is another thing I know is a pretty common criticism of a lot of movies, and not that it doesn't always stand, but I think this is a particular case where you could chalk it up to that. It was hard. It was kind of hard to get invested in throughout, but then once it reaches that last third, either you're gonna be into where it goes, but more than likely you might just be jarred by the fact that we're going on such a different path, and it basically just opens up another thing that we don't really need when we're already trying to piece together so much already. And it's just tiresome, like I said, not in a good way. But it's fine, I guess. It has those elements in there that do work, but they're just overpowered by the stuff that doesn't. So yeah, I think that's going to be it for these. Pretty much right after this, I'll be doing a movie or a video on the Loki series with my brother, and then I'm going to do that Nicolas Cage video I was talking about, where we talk about some of his latest movies, over the past couple of years, and then whatever's next from there. The Suicide Squad will be on Friday, and yeah, so we'll see what happens from there. So until then, I think that's it.